Your lecturer is Linda Chalker Scott. Dr. Chalker Scott is an extension specialist in urban horticulture and an associate professor of horticulture at Washington State University. She received her PhD in horticulture from Oregon State University. Dr. Chalker Scott is the author of several books, including The Informed Gardener and How Plants Work. She has delivered more than 400 seminars to diverse audiences and is one of the founding Garden Professors, a group of university faculty who provide science-based information for gardeners through their blog and social media.
If you spend any time on the internet, you certainly will have seen recommendations for all sorts of products and practices that promise to work miracles in your garden. You've doubtlessly read that common household chemicals can be used successfully in your gardens and landscapes as fertilizers or pesticides. Dish soap, Epsom salts, vinegar, baking soda, molasses, cinnamon, basically your whole kitchen. But are these claims valid? Well, I've spent the last 20 years looking at the science, or lack thereof, behind these recommendations and have become a garden mythbuster as a result. But I didn't start out that way, even while I was getting my PhD in horticulture. I'll give you some examples of how I cared for our home garden during that time. When I planted new trees and shrubs, I was very careful not to disturb the root ball. I'd add lots of good compost to backfill and stake larger trees securely to keep them upright. I raked the soil to keep it clear of leaf litter, and with our container plants, I'd always add a layer of gravel at the bottom to improve drainage. I'm sure some of these activities sound familiar to you, and it turns out that none of them are based on sound science. It took me years before I discovered my practices were improper, all during the time when I was actively teaching and conducting research in basic plant physiology. My understanding of applied plant physiology began when I accepted a position at the University of Washington. Among other things, I taught a course in landscape plant selection and management. I had avoided these types of courses during my PhD work, focusing instead on physiology and biochemistry. So I had a steep learning curve to climb. As I became more familiar with practical soil and plant sciences, I also became aware that many so-called common sense gardening practices were just plain wrong. They didn't mesh with what I knew to be accurate information about plant physiology and biochemistry. Many of these common sense practices were those that I'd used in my home garden during my PhD work. In this course, you'll find out why gravel doesn't help with drainage, why disturbing the root balls and trees of shrubs is a great idea, and why staking is nothing more than enabling bad tree behavior. In this course, I'll introduce you to the most current and relevant research on all aspects of home gardening and landscaping, with an emphasis on permanent landscapes, the trees, the shrubs, and woody perennials that make up the backbone and the most significant investment of a sustainable garden. We'll take a look, both in the studio and in the field, at many common problems that home gardeners face, and you'll learn why the latest well-meaning advice from your neighbor or an online gardening group may not be the best approach. You'll leave this course not only a better curator of your landscape, but also a better curator of sound gardening science. One of the questions that always pops into my head when I hear the newest faulty advice is, where does all of this misinformation come from? Let's start by answering that question by looking at the historical roots of what we know and what we think we know about gardening. First of all, what I'm interested in is urban horticulture. You may have heard of this, maybe it's ornamental horticulture or environmental horticulture. I also like arboriculture, which is a subset looking specifically at trees. These are relatively new fields of applied science. Historically, what we've done in terms of research is looked at food and fiber related crops. This is where the money is, this is where it's important economically, and this is important for people. So grant money from the USDA and other funding sources is still geared at researching food and fiber-related crops, not on ornamental plants. So products and practices that were relevant to maximizing agricultural production are what were developed, not things that were developed for gardeners. And some of these things might be similar to what you find in a vegetable garden, but many of them are not appropriate for looking at long-term landscapes. Specifically, fertilizers were found that would maximize production, and pesticides were found that would minimize damage from insects and other types of pests. On the other hand, urban landscapes, home gardens, public green spaces like parks, ecological restoration sites, these are not production agriculture sites, nor are they forestry sites. They are long-term sustainable landscapes that must be managed in a different way. So that's one difference, is the plant life cycles of these two systems. The second is thinking about what's happening to the soil. When you're producing things in an agricultural sense, you're going in, you're plowing, you're seeding, you're harvesting, you're plowing again, working organic matter back into the soil, and that works well when you're maximizing crop production. But again, this is something you're probably not going to be doing with your home landscape, because then you're going to be plowing up all those perennials whose roots are established into that soil. Then think about the life that is in that landscape. If you look at a monocultural agricultural system, again, whatever the crop is, that's what's being managed for. There's nothing else there. The weeds are taken out. There's obviously going to be insects and possibly some other animals that live there, but it's a pretty sparse amount of life in terms of diversity. In your landscape, you want more life. You want to have these different types of plants, the insects, the birds, a lot of these are beneficial. You want diverse life. So again, a little bit different management goal there rather than just trying to keep a monoculture growing. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is thinking about the use of fertilizers and pesticides. The goal in production agriculture is to maximize production, to get as much out of that field as you can in the shortest amount of time. Part of that is by using lots of fertilizers, and part of that is to reduce pest damage by using pesticides. So fertilizers and pesticides have always been a historical part of agricultural production. But this is not how we should sustain a long-term landscape system. In a research void like this, there is a plethora of anecdotal, irrelevant, and unverified information. There's a lot of problems associated with following these types of advice, and they include things like basically disappointing results. You try something that you've heard about on the internet or that your neighbors told you about, and you don't get anything. Or maybe you think you get something, but that's because you're really hoping you are. But if you were to test it, you wouldn't see very good results. Secondly, it's a waste of time and money and natural resources. Some of these things that appear to be nice natural approaches to managing pests or to adding nutrients to the soil do a lot of damage, they waste resources, and they waste time, and they waste your money. Third, and this is a real important point, is that there is a danger to people, to pets, and the environment by using unverified chemicals in your landscape. They may seem like they're nice, safe household chemicals, but they're chemicals, and adding chemicals that have no real true function in the landscape is going to cause damage downstream someplace. Unlike products and practices that are related to food and drugs, there's no regulatory agency for most of these types of gardening recommendations. You can find all kinds of materials that are sold as biostimulants or tonics or potions, and they're these great terms, but there's absolutely no science or regulation behind them. When you look at things like fertilizers and pesticides, again, these are things that were formulated primarily for agricultural production. Those are regulated. You know exactly how much nutrient content is in a fertilizer. You know what the active ingredients are of pesticides. They're regulated by an agency. But there's no agency out there that ferrets out the snake oil that is oftentimes sold to unsuspecting gardeners. There is great emotional appeal underlying many of these worthless recommendations. First of all, there's that folk wisdom feel. You heard it from your grandmother, you heard it from the old guy next door. It just sounds like great information that's been passed down through generations. Or maybe it just sounds like good common sense. I mean, I've heard many gardeners say it's nothing but common sense approaches to do gardening right. Or maybe it's because it's the do-it-yourself approach. Lots of people like to be able to do their own thing in the garden, make their own products and potions, and not have to rely on buying them from the store. Many of these products and practices have these great names that appeal to your emotions. Words like tea, lasagna, and all these things make you feel warm and fuzzy, And then that warm and fuzzy feeling you are then putting onto your garden and landscape. A great example of a body of gardening information comes from permaculture. And this is a great example in terms of appealing to your emotions, but not necessarily basing all the recommendations on science. So let's consider the problem with permaculture. What is it exactly? Well, it really is a marriage of two things. It's a marriage of some science and then philosophy. Now, while science is testable, philosophy is not. So we can look at the different types of practices that are recommended and we can test them to see if they actually work, but you can't really test and prove a philosophy. So this whole approach really kind of falls into the category of pseudoscience. And I don't mean this in a pejorative way, just in an explanatory way. What pseudoscience means is you're using terminology that kind of sounds like science, but they're not scientific terms and they aren't based on scientific processes. The second red flag in terms of pseudoscience is you don't really have an experimental evidence to support your recommendations. Instead, anecdotal observations are considered to be just as good as science and better if science doesn't exist. Some permaculture practices, especially the ones that are based on ecological science, unfortunately are outdated or incorrectly applied. And this is rather important because ecology as a field really began its growth in the 1960s. And if you read a lot of the permaculture books, you'll see that recommendations are coming from those old texts where ecology really was pretty young. It's changed a lot in the decades following, but that information has not translated back down into permaculture. Some of the other permaculture practices, which include things like lasagna mulching and hugelkultur, are not based on scientific principles. Now, they sound great. They've got that emotional appeal to their name. Lasagna mulching, lasagna gardening. It's one of those things, you know how good you feel when you eat lasagna. Think about how great your garden's going to feel if it's got lasagna on top of it. Hugelkultur is an exotic word. It's German in origin. You're told that it has centuries of practice behind it. So there's that folk wisdom, there's the exoticness, there's the whole world type of approach to gardening, which is very appealing, plus lasagna. And you look at the basics behind both of these practices. The lasagna gardening is based on mulching to prepare soil for planting and to get rid of weeds and just get the nutrients back in the soil. So that seems to make sense. In terms of hugelkultur, it means mound gardening. What happens with hugelkultur, it's pretty much upside down gardening. You put woody material on the bottom, and then you put on more broken down material, and you end up with soil on top. The lasagna mulching is layers of material. So you have cardboard, then you put on compost, and you put on cardboard and compost, and so you're making lasagna. You've got the noodles, which is the cardboard, and you've got the sauce, which is the compost. So that's what's appealing. But unfortunately, it's those parts, it's the building of those things that really don't make any sense from a scientific viewpoint. So if you look at this from what happens in nature, these things don't naturally occur. When you look at what happens with mulch layers, for instance, in a forest, you've got woody material that's coming down on top and it's breaking down, and you're having material at the bottom that becomes finer and finer until you finally reach the soil. And I invite you sometime to go out into the woods to see this. You need to be in a conifer forest or hardwood forest. Look what's on top. It's branches, it's big stuff. And then you pull it apart and you'll find that it's starting to break down. You get down to the soil and that's the real fine compost. That's what naturally happens. It doesn't work the other way around. So using this as something that's based on ecology just isn't accurate because you can't find examples of this in nature. Not only are these processes counterproductive, sometimes they can cause real damage. Let's look at the lasagna garden model as an example. If you have layers of cardboard and then compost, cardboard and compost and so on, again, not only does it not occur in nature, but you're actually constructing a barrier to water and oxygen movement. Think about what cardboard is. It's something that's made to resist water. They wouldn't be using it to ship all those boxes all over the world if there were things that were going to fall apart immediately. So cardboard is something that's naturally resistant to water. And putting layers upon layers upon layers over your soil means water can't get in or out, and neither can oxygen. So this is causing an oxygen deficit to your soil, and it's something that should be avoided, not encouraged. So when you hear about these types of products and practices that are promoted by people that are really excited about do-it-yourself or folklore gardening or common sense gardening, you have to insist on proof. And what the proof is scientific evidence. And the onus really is on proponents to provide that peer-reviewed, published scientific evidence to support their claims. The onus is not on science to prove that it doesn't work. So part of what I want to do is help you learn how to assess gardening information. We need to think about the sources that are out there. There's lots of written material. Some of it's really good, some of it's not so good. How can you figure out which is which? Well, this pretty much falls into three categories. First of all, we have scientific journals. There's some great ones out there that are easy enough to understand and that are relevant to gardens and landscapes. They might include the Journal of Environmental Horticulture, Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, and Hort Technology. Now, these journals are peer-reviewed. They go through a blind review process. They're meant for an academic audience. The drawback, of course, is because it's an academic audience, it can be a little bit dry. They're pretty much in the standard type of format where you have an abstract, an introduction. Materials and methods result in a discussion, which is really interesting, but sometimes can be a little bit much. So that's the drawback, is they can be a little bit dense and turgid to wade through. Then there are the professional journals. This includes what I would call gray literature, and again, not a pejorative term. It just means it's kind of in the middle of the continuum. And these might include things like American Nurseryman, Biocycle, Arborist News. These are all kind of magazines for professionals that want to know about the newest information. The difference here is while they're edited, they're not peer-reviewed. So depending on who the author is, they may say things that are substantial, they may say things that aren't. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. And the third type of literature, and probably the things you're most familiar with, are the popular books and magazines. These might be things like Fine Gardening or Mother Earth News, or the plethora of books that are out there that are meant for the gardening audience. Of course, because they are popular publications, they're not peer-reviewed. They're edited, and some of them are very readable, but again, depending on who your author is, it could be excellent information, or it could be pretty sketchy information. And the audience in this case is the general public. There are some great online resources as well. The .edu sites are university websites, the .gov websites are the government websites. And on these websites you might find peer-reviewed university extension publications. They're written specifically for gardeners. You can find EPA fact sheets that have information on pesticides that you might be interested in. Those are good, mostly peer-reviewed resources, but again, could be double-checked every once in a while if you find something that is rather questionable. The .com websites, those are commercial websites. It doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. A lot of good information can be found on those, but you have to be aware that they are .coms, and they may be selling something rather than just providing good information. And then there's things like open access scientific journals that you can find online. This is a good and bad thing. It's great having the information out there for everybody to read, but the question is it good information? So the types of questions you'd want to ask are, is it a peer-reviewed journal? Or is it a pay-for-play journal, one of the ones where you can pay and basically have anything you want published? So what we'll be doing during this course is evaluating a lot of information, and I have what I call the CRAP test to do this. We'll go into the CRAP test in a future lecture. But basically what CRAP stands for is credibility, relevance, accuracy, and purpose. How credible is your resource? Who's the author? Who's the publisher? Is it relevant to you as a home gardener? Is it accurate or is it very dated? And what's the purpose? Is the purpose to give you good information or is it to sell a product? So we'll be looking at different assessment categories. And one of these categories is hugely populated with products and practices, and I call it science doesn't support the information. This might be something like the B1 vitamin transplant fertilizers that you can find on the nursery shelves. Well, it turns out the plants actually make their own vitamin B1. You don't have to add it. It's a waste of money and resources. The second type of information that I've categorized is what I call misapplied science. And misapplied science has use in one place, but is being used someplace else incorrectly. An example might be foliar fertilizers. These are things that are great for testing nutrient deficiencies in leaves. You can spray them on and see if the color changes. If it does, you've identified a deficiency, but it's not a way to feed plants. Then there's what I call over-extrapolated information. And this is when you've tested something in a lab situation or perhaps in a greenhouse, very controlled situation, it works. But then when you take it out to the field, it doesn't work. And a good example of this is harpin protein. Now, harpin protein is something that's naturally found in a disease organism. It happens to turn on defenses in plant cells, but the only way it works is when you can get this protein into the plant cell. You can easily do this in the laboratory, in a petri dish, but you can't do it in the field on plants because they've got that nice protective cuticle. You can't get that protein inside the leaves. And then there's the fourth category that I'm going to call scientific errors. And this is when you might have unqualified researchers, people that don't have any training in what they're publishing about. Researcher bias, we're all human, we're all biased, and sometimes, our biases creep into our publications. And peer review failure. And this is what happens when people don't catch the bias or they don't catch the fact that people aren't educated in the field they're publishing in. So all these things come together. So you've got these scientific errors, and this is really difficult for the non-scientist to ferret out. And a great example of this is what you'll probably see on the internet every place, especially if you're a gardener, about how glyphosate is the cause of all human health hazards in the world. And this is one of the things that's been published in pay-for-play journals by people who have no experience in soil science, in plant science, or in human medicine, that are basically just taking information, looking at correlations, and then scaring people into thinking that glyphosate is this horrible toxic material in terms of human exposure. Now, we'll be looking at how effective glyphosate is as an herbicide later on in this course, but my point here is that thousands of articles have verified the relative safety of glyphosate to humans. Anything that challenges a substantial body of scientific evidence like this must clear a high bar, and that just hasn't been done in this case. So why should we care about using scientifically validated practices and products? Well, we'll save money and time and natural resources by avoiding unnecessary products and practices. We'll reduce the use of pesticides and fertilizers, meaning we won't contaminate our soils and we won't contribute to watershed pollution. We'll understand applied plant and soil science and be able to diagnose landscape problems. And this is a great way of learning more about your landscape and having it speak to you and you knowing what to do in response. We'll pay more attention to the natural processes in our personal gardens and landscapes. And we'll be healthier physically, mentally, and spiritually by developing closer connections to our gardens. In this lecture, we've considered the sources of gardening information: the good, the bad, and sometimes really wacky. The gardening world is a wild west of products and practices that exist in a regulation-free environment. So we need to understand that before adopting practices and products, especially those with strong emotional appeals, we need to look for supporting evidence before we make decisions. And if we are surprised by the evidence, maybe even disagreeing with it, we need to realize that accepting scientific evidence means accepting all of it, not just those parts we agree with. Throughout this course, you will probably discover that you adhere to some questionable gardening principles, and that's perfectly normal. It happened to me during my PhD work in horticulture, so it shouldn't be surprising that other gardeners would make the same mistakes. It's a brave new gardening world where information is rapidly evolving, and it can be difficult to keep up with the science. Sadly, there are no miracle cures for pests and diseases. There are no magical products that are being suppressed by commercial interests. There is no forgotten techniques that have been recently rediscovered. What we do have is a young and growing body of science-based information that can help us create and maintain sustainable gardens and landscapes. I'm excited to share that information with you throughout this course.